Before you fall asleep tonight, let me tell you a story. Not the kind meant to scare you awake, but the kind that quietly follows you into your dreams. Welcome to Sleeping Storyteller, where true mysteries, strange encounters, and unsettling stories are told slowly, gently, in the dark. These stories are not actually true, but if true, it's just a coincidence. This story was gathered from forgotten files, late-night reports, and moments that are never fully explained. And consider this story as your bedtime. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the night do the rest. This is Sleeping Storyteller. Let the story begin. The Haunting of LaLaurie Mansion. Part 1. The Grand Masquerade of Shadows. The wrought iron balconies of the French Quarter hung over Royal Street like frozen lace, while the humid air of New Orleans carried the scent of rotting jasmine and river mud. Julian Vance stood before the towering doors of the LaLaurie mansion with a heavy brass key clutched in his palm. He had inherited the property through a distant and nameless branch of his lineage, but the air around the stone entrance felt like a warning rather than a welcome. The mansion was a monolith of gray stone and dark history, and every local in the city knew to cross the street before passing its threshold. They spoke of Madame Delphine and the fire of 1834, and the things the firemen found in the attic that had never truly left the physical world. Julian did not believe in ghosts, but as he pushed the doors open, the silence that greeted him was heavy and suffocating, as if the house had been holding its breath for nearly 2 centuries. He entered the grand foyer, where a massive crystal chandelier hung like a cluster of jagged ice from the ceiling. The floor was made of black and white marble that resembled a chessboard where the pieces had all been lost. Julian moved his light across the walls, where the portraits of former residents had been stripped away, leaving only dark rectangles of dust. He began his ascent of the grand staircase, where the wood groaned with a sound that resembled a human moan. The higher he climbed, the more the air began to change. It became thick with a copper tang that Julian recognized as the smell of fresh blood. He told himself it was the iron in the old pipes or the dampness of the Louisiana soil, but his heart began to beat against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was headed for the 3rd floor where the attic was located because he felt a pull that was stronger than his fear. When he reached the 3rd floor landing, he saw a door that was separate from the others. It was made of heavy oak and was reinforced with iron bars that had been installed from the outside, as if to keep something in rather than out. Julian turned the key, and the door swung open to reveal a space that felt disconnected from the rest of the house. The temperature dropped until his breath clouded the air in front of him. In the center of the room, he saw a faint glow that did not come from his flashlight. It was a shimmering distortion in the air that smelled of lavender perfume and scorched flesh. He heard the sound of a woman laughing, a high and melodic sound that chilled him to his marrow. It was the laugh of Madame Delphine, and it was followed by the sound of heavy chains rattling across the floorboards. Julian aimed his light at the corner and saw the silhouette of a woman in a velvet dress, but her hands were covered in a black fluid that dripped onto the floor with a rhythmic thud. The room began to expand as the walls of the attic started to bleed a dark and viscous liquid. Julian tried to turn back, but the door had vanished into a wall of solid stone. He was trapped in the memory of the mansion. He saw the flicker of flames licking at the edges of his vision and heard the screams of the people who had been kept in the secret rooms above the ballroom. They were not screaming for mercy, but for an end to the silence. The shadow of the woman moved toward him, and as she approached, her face shifted from a mask of beauty to a hollow shell of malice. She reached out and touched Julian on the forehead, and he felt a surge of every drop of pain that had ever occurred within the walls. He fell to his knees as the floor beneath him turned into a sea of reaching hands, and his own voice was lost in the chorus of the damned who still called Royal Street their home. Part 2. The Chamber of Broken Echoes. Julian woke on the cold floor of the attic, but the sun was nowhere to be found. The windows of the mansion had been painted over with a thick black pigment that blocked out the New Orleans sky. He tried to stand, but his limbs felt heavy, as if they were being weighed down by invisible shackles. The sound of the woman's laughter had been replaced by a low and rhythmic chanting in a language that sounded like a mix of French and something much older. He followed the sound through the narrow corridors of the servant quarters, where the walls were so close they seemed to be pressing in on his shoulders. He found himself in a small room that contained nothing but a wooden table and a collection of surgical tools that were rusted with time and use. The scent of carbolic acid was so strong that it made his eyes water and his lungs burn. He saw a figure hunched over the table, and for a moment, he thought it was a doctor from the past. But when the figure turned, he saw that it was a man whose skin had been sewn together from different pieces of cloth and leather. This was one of the victims of the mansion who had been transformed into a living experiment. The entity did not attack Julian, but instead pointed toward a mirror on the wall. Julian looked into the glass and did not see his own reflection. He saw the face of a man who had lived in the 1800s, and he realized that the mansion was using his body as a bridge between the eras. The black fluid under his skin began to pulse, and he felt his own features shifting to match the man in the mirror. The pain was sharp and cold, as if his bones were being rearranged by invisible hands. The mansion began to groan around him, as if the house itself was a living organism that needed to be fed. Julian realized that the inheritance was not a gift of property, but a debt of blood. The LaLaurie family had fled the city, but they had left a void that needed to be filled by a descendant of their line. He heard the sound of a carriage arriving on the street below, and the phantom sounds of a gala beginning in the ballroom. He was forced to walk down the stairs as his body moved against his will. He entered the ballroom where hundreds of shadows were dancing in silence. They were all dressed in the finest silks and satins, but their faces were nothing but hollow pits of darkness. At the head of the room sat Madame Delphine on a throne made of bone and iron. She smiled at Julian and beckoned him to join the dance. As he was pulled into the circle of shadows, Julian felt his memories of the outside world fading away. He forgot the name of his mother and the city he had come from. He became a part of the permanent guest list of the LaLaurie mansion. Every time he tried to scream, the sound was trapped in his throat and turned into a musical note that joined the orchestra of the dead. He saw the fire starting again in the kitchens and felt the heat of the flames, but the shadows did not stop dancing. They were trapped in a loop of eternal celebration and eternal agony. Julian looked at his hands and saw that they were now as white as marble, and his fingernails were stained with the same black fluid he had seen in the attic. He was no longer Julian Vance, but a ghost in a velvet suit, waiting for the next owner to unlock the front door. Part 3. The Eternal Masquerade. Years passed in a single night inside the walls of Royal Street. The mansion had a way of folding time like a piece of paper until the past and the present were the same thing. Julian spent his days standing in the windows, looking down at the tourists who took photos of the house from the safety of the sidewalk. He tried to wave to them, but his hands would not move. He tried to cry out for help, but the only sound that came from his mouth was the faint chime of a clock striking midnight. He saw the city change as the horse-drawn carriages were replaced by motor cars and the gas lamps were replaced by electric lights. But inside the mansion, nothing changed. The smell of blood and lavender remained as fresh as the day Madame Delphine first fled the angry mob. One evening, a young woman with a camera and a notebook arrived at the gate. She looked just like the journalist Julian used to work with in his former life. He felt a spark of his old self flicker in his chest as he watched her enter the foyer. He wanted to scream at her to run, but he found himself moving toward the grand staircase to greet her. He was no longer the victim, but the host. He felt the presence of Madame Delphine standing behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder with a cold and motherly touch. She whispered that the house was hungry again and that it was time to welcome the new guest to the attic. Julian felt a wave of horror as he realized that he was being forced to play the role of the monster. He led the woman up the stairs and into the third-floor room where the iron bars were waiting. As she stepped over the threshold, he saw the look of wonder on her face turn into a look of pure terror. She saw the black fluid on the floor and the shadows reaching from the corners. Julian tried to hold back, but the mansion moved his arms to lock the door behind her. He saw her reflection in the mirror and watched as her features began to dissolve into the gray mist of the house. The cycle was beginning again, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He was the guardian of the LaLaurie secrets, and he would remain in the shadows of Royal Street until the stones of the building turned to dust. The story of the LaLaurie mansion is not one of ghosts that haunt the living, but of a house that consumes them. As the sun rose over the French Quarter, the young woman's camera was found sitting on the sidewalk in front of the gate. There was no sign of her inside, and the police found the mansion to be as empty and silent as it had been for decades. But if you stand on the street at midnight and look up at the third-floor windows, you might see a man in a velvet suit standing next to a woman in a white dress. They are not looking at the city, but at each other as they wait for the music to start again. The shadows of New Orleans never leave, they only wait for a new body to wear.